Well,
Bill,
we are delighted to finally see you, Bill.
There you go. There you go. I'm not sure if that's a good thing after all, but there was a time when I thought that might have been good, but those days drifted away. I don't know what happened. Went away with the hair color, I think. Why don't I do sort of the origin? And I kind of feel like, I got the paper partway, and then you reformatted everything and put a lot of zing and polished it up and made it possible. So it's kind of a two-half story here where I got it so far, and then Thomas carried us over the line.
I think the origin was when you visited us in St. Gallen, and you kind of walked.
Wait, save it for the interview.
We'll say that. We'll
No, I think that was the starting point, and then we took it from there.
You guys can have a fist fight over it during the interview. How about that?
Yeah, we can do that.
Well, hello and welcome to the Academy of Management Review Origin Series. My name is Rich McIntosh. I'm your host, and I'm also a professor of management at Purdue University's Krannert School of Management. Today, I'll be interviewing Bill Schulze and Thomas Zellweger on about their forthcoming, recently accepted paper called Property Rights, Owner Management, and Venture Creation, which will be forthcoming in Academy of Management Review. Gentlemen, welcome to the Origin Series.
Thanks for having us, Rich.
Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So tell us a little bit first about the paper itself. Give us a kind of a brief elevator pitch explanation for the manuscript.
Okay, so I think one of the starting points for this whole debate about property rights and value creation was the observation that, in a way, concentrated control ownership in the hands of an owner manager, in a way, is a double-edged sword. It clearly comes with benefits but also costs. And we'll link these benefits and the costs to the three classical property rights of use, appropriation, and transfer. And you can see in the table how these three rights are defined. And and linking these property rights to the concentrated control in the hands of the owner manager leads us to realize that these property rights leads to stakeholder commitment advantages, especially when it comes to use rights. They come in the form of strategic benefits that you actually can pursue creative novel strategies. So it comes with innovation advantages, strategic agility. If you move to the right of appropriation, it's tied to incentive benefits, because after all, bills are paid, all the residual goes to you. So this right of appropriation comes with a strong incentive to be successful. And finally, the right to define about when the other two rights are transferred comes with this possibility to make very credible commitments. So these commitment benefits. But, and I think that's in a way also the true novelty here, is that we also show the dark side of these property rights from content that are tied to this concentrated control in the hands of the owner manager. So the first one is the reliability hazard. So for stakeholders who in a way try to commit and think about committing to this owner manager, in a way face this threat of being treated in unreliable fashion, from misaligned goals between the owner manager and the resource providers. There's also this issue of if you are very concerned about the profit you're making, you may engage in micromanagement, in becoming a control freak, so what we call egocentrism hazard. And finally, what is so well known in literature about not willing to let go. So there are all these succession hazards that are the third dark side of owner management.
Okay, so you're looking at the pros and cons of being an owner manager, and those pros and cons are broken out into the three aspects of property rights: right to use, right to appropriate, and right to transfer. Very interesting. So You also then discuss in the paper some potential mitigating remedies for these problems, and so that's described here in your table too. You want to talk briefly about that?
Sure. The idea behind it is that ownership gives you an awful lot of ability to pursue your dream, implement a theory of value, create value if you're ambitious and so forth. But to do that, you got to get cooperation from people. And to get people's cooperation, you have to get their commitment. And the types of things that Thomas just talked about sort of describes both the incentives and the reasons and the advantages you have from ownership, but also the threats, the things that undermine your ability to get people to work hard to achieve those goals. So when you try to bounce those off in order to get people to commit to you, really, it's a question of getting them to commit your genius to your enterprise. If you're trying to create value, you got to get people to join in, enthusiastic, lose sleep, all that sort of stuff. So how do you do that? And if they're depending strictly upon you and you exercise all the property rights, they're vulnerable. So you have to extend them some assurances. One of them is social control. You can make public declarations, you can commit to serving social needs, you can do a variety of things that are public declarations of the way you're going to behave, sort of an institutional type argument. Delegation's another mechanism. You make commitments to managers and others, and you also submit to managers, you delegate authority. When people have authority, they're better able to pursue their ambitions and dreams. There's problems there, but it helps an awful lot when you empower people, and also promise not to interfere. You implement a board. You voluntarily you form a board and say, okay, I'm going to act on the advice of my board members. That reins you in a little bit, professionalizes your conduct, makes you rationalize what you do, or at least justify your whims. And you can do partial allocation of ownership. So when you promise shares, distribute ownership, and so forth, you give people voice, you give people rights. All those things are sort of protections that hopefully will make people more willing and confident that you are, as the owner, going to deliver on your promise, and so that their passion and genius is well invested. Okay,
great. Now, let me show you what this reminded me of when I was looking at the paper.
Okay.
How about that?
That's it.
Yeah.
Early on, that's perfect, because early on, when Thomas, in earlier drafts of this paper, when we first were presenting it and getting feedback, we kept on running into this thing about Odysseus tying his hands in the sirens, and I think we mentioned that in
right.
The thing. And the great thing about that is it occurred to both of us. We were talking about how important it was that the owner bind their hands so they could really follow through on that commitment. And then Thomas was going through a presentation by a family business owner from Zurich, I think, I can't remember where. And at the end of this presentation, there was the side of Odysseus, and the guy was saying, I need to tie my hand. This was the most important thing I could do as owner of this firm, was to bind my hands so that I could better commit to my employees. And that's made all the difference in my success.
How interesting that they're aware of the problem, right? That they're, that at least some people can see this coming.
I think so. It's actually a very old question about tying the king's hand. I mean, it goes back to early philosophers who actually thought about, how do you make credible commitments if you have full power? And it goes back to what actually in medieval times, kings asked themselves how to raise money if you are all powerful. So it's a very old question that actually, it goes back to Greek philosophy. It reappeared in medieval times, when indeed wars had to be financed. So it all goes back to this idea of tying your own hands and self-control. And that also made it very passionate for Bill and me to think about these things, and also kind of go beyond what agency theory says and about all the benefits of owner management and try to find that mechanism that explains why some of these firms do not grow, because even though they would have all this alignment between ownership and management.
Mhm.
So let me share my screen one more time to show you one other thing. This is actually the original cartoon from which that quotation was taken. Many people don't know this. This cartoon was created for Earth Day in 1971, as you can see here in the lower left corner, right? And
Wow.
here's Pogo and his companion, and they're walking through the beautiful primeval woods. So the Earth Day thing is important here because the quotation is really about externalities. So they're walking through the primeval, beautiful forest, and of course, walking over sticks and rocks and mud and everything. And Pogo's companion says, "Ah, the beauty of the forest primeval gets me in the heart." And of course, Pogo says back to Porcupine, he says, "It gets me in the feet, Porcupine," because he's walking on all these rocks and sticks and he's walking barefoot. But then it's the next panel where Porcupine says, "It is hard walking on this stuff." So they've transitioned now from the primeval pristine forest to the garbage dump. And Pogo says, "Yep, son, we have met the enemy and he is us." And so, what I was thinking as I read the paper, as I connected it to this cartoon was, are you really just talking about externalities in some sense? Is there an externality interpretation of what you're talking about? Because that's really what this is, what the cartoon is showing here is, we're our own worst enemy because of the externalities that lead us to do things that are really not in our own self-interest.
I don't think so, Rich.
Oh, okay.
And the reason I'll let me go back to sort of the origin story of the paper. I mean, this came out, I was really fortunate. I had a sabbatical and I reached out to Thomas and he welcomed me to St. Gallen, which was just a fantastic experience. And my goal in going there was to revisit a paper that I did in 2001, in which I kind of provided the bare outlines of a theory of the private firm. And in that paper, the problem I observed was that in family firms, they're thick with agency cost. But
Right.
Agency theory says there's no agency cost in private firms. So what's going on? And what that led me to at one point was Elchin and Woodward and Elchin's great commentary on theories of the firm and the challenge of cooperation. And Elchin basically said, if you're going to come together and cooperate, you've got a bunch of agency problems you got to solve. One of them is people don't always do what they say they will, which is the problem of moral hazard.
Right.
You've got the problem that you don't know how reliable people are or what their quality is, which is the problem of adverse selection. You got a problem of incomplete information, which basically means that, something may change in the future and you as the principal may have to change your mind. Situation may change and you find yourself at risk. Okay. And then the last one that Elchin didn't talk about, but Jensen talked about at length, and is self-control. That you have to rely, if you're going to rely on a principal, the principal has to be reliable.
Right.
Problem is, occasionally principals want to have dessert first and they change their mind. And that can expose the agent to problems. Now, each of those is turned into a major theory of the firm. Moral hazard, of course, is agency. The problem of holdup or incomplete information is transactions cost. Adverse selection is risk. And self-control is behavioral economics. Each of those theories developed theoretically in a world where they assumed that, the firm operated in more or less efficient markets and, surrounded by competitive factor markets, capital markets, and so forth. And in isolation in the Western corporation, you assume that the owners are autonomous and you can assume away the threat of the other ones. So agency looks at agency in isolation, TCE looks at holdup in isolation and so forth. But if you go inside the private firms are surrounded by inefficient factor markets. They're privately held, so the capital markets don't work. They're privately held, so labor markets aren't as competitive and so forth. And what that means is that all of these problems are present inside the private firm. So a theory of the private firm is theoretically complex because you got all of these things interacting with each other and exacerbating the other. And I used that in that 2001 paper to explain why private firms were exposed to agency costs. And in that case, it was the agency cost created by having related family members inside the firm, dad wanting to make decisions differently because they cared about their kids, and that created problems for everybody else and so forth.
Sure.
That was the architecture of that paper in 2001. I hadn't fleshed that out or really thought about it. And so when I got to St. Gallen, I started talking to Thomas about that. And we sort of fleshed it out. And I can't remember, Thomas, do you remember how we eventually ended up shifting over into viewing this and the problem of wealth creation as one of the exercise of property right?
I think we were at that point where we realized that concentrated control is the key, because that was, ownership and management coinciding with one single person. So agency was not the issue. Right. So we were looking kind of the other, this ideal, kind of mechanism that would explain what's going on. And that led us to these commitment problems too. We looked into Klein, Crawford, Algen, and TCE, and some of Ross Koff's work, and then we looked for. I came across these three property rights in a way, created a structure around these ideas.
Right. And, we remember we talked about sort of introduced to Hansman and Lindstout, and we kind of went through all that stuff.
But let me add a practical angle to this. If you observe people like Elon Musk.
Mm-hmm.
I would say he's the perfect example where you can see these benefits and costs at play. Because at the same time, he's truly incentivized. This guy is super motivated. Secondly, he's super creative, and he's able to make handshake deals as he wishes.
Right.
At the same time, if you buy a stock in that company, if you work for him, probably you do not know what you're going to end up with tomorrow.
You need a seatbelt to hold you into the roller coaster.
This is exactly, if you lend money, if you buy a stock, if you go to work for this company, for him, I guess you're a bit at this risk of being, held up. And that's kind of this, this jansfaced element being right in front of us here. And I think you see it. If you take a close look at owner-managed companies, you see it all over the place, and then every day. And I think these people themselves are in a way in these tensions between exercising control and delegating control on a daily basis.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's another problem that talking about Baker about that is that, when it's a private firm, you delegate management, but if it's your wealth at risk, the agents, your managers, aren't really going to know what's in your self-interest. So you always have to make a decision about whether or not you're going to defer to the managers, keep them empowered and motivated, or are you going to intervene? Baker argued that when managers have superior information, you as the owner should always exercise forbearance. But if the manager doesn't know that, then it's really in your interest to intervene. So there's always this tension between when a desire to intervene, there's incentive to intervene. And so property rights are self-motivating. They're self-incentivizing in that you can always at the margin improve your welfare. And that's kind of tough. And, Musk does that in different ways. I mean, he finds it in his interest to smoke pot on, during the Zoom interview and gets, chastised by his board and by the SEC and this and that. I mean, the guy in some ways is completely out of control. Other times he pulls it back in. He's wealthy enough that he doesn't care about that, but at some point the piper is going to have to be paid. And
but your point is he may not care, but his employees care, and if he cares to have employees, right, then he should care.
Right, and of course the stock analysts went. We're just thrilled when he made a few jokes that killed his stock price for a few days. As what, an April Fool? It's tomorrow. Who knows? Maybe he'll do another April Fool's joke and destroy shareholder value for another day or two.
So that gives me some idea about how the project got started and where the ideas came from. Tell me a little bit, what made this project and the answer may be different for each of you. What made this project interesting enough for you to want to devote your time to it?
For me, it was a matter of, these are questions that I'd been thinking about probably since I was a doctoral student. Started wrestling with in 95, 96 with Mike Labatkin. Played around with them for a while, but until 2015, really didn't have the bandwidth or focus to sit down and really try to think about the private firm as a problem, and to think a little bit more in depth about the problem of value creation. I'm always interested in entrepreneurship. There's sort of a puzzle. Why do we see private firms create great wealth, and then of course they go public and things like that? And I don't think that's entirely a matter of mere incentive. I think there's something else about what's going on. And so there was just a puzzle that I was always curious about. And I was fortunate to run into Thomas and to have the bandwidth and opportunity to work with him to get it to work on those issues.
How about Thomas, for you? What made the project interesting enough for you to want to devote your time?
There was this observation that always struck me, and I think when Bill and I started to talk about this, is that in a way we really have a big theoretical misunderstanding about the closely held company. Because I think in a way we will lack a theory for the private firm, because especially for the governance of the private firms and how these firms create value, because everything that's a typical governance, actually governance is a non-issue in these firms from a classical corporate governance standpoint. But at the same time, we see these firms run into, governance issues, commitment problems, and in a way have issues to scale and then find good people. That was more the practical side that I found interesting. Why do these people have issues with finding good people, keeping good people, motivating people, when all, theoretically should be so elegantly solved with an owner being also the CEO? Mm-hmm. So in a way, this coincidence of a theoretical gap and a practical observation with the coincidence, Bill kind of, looking at the same issues, these three things coming together in a way. But this is a big question, and I think we worked really hard to in a way solve this issue and get through the review process and finally get this paper published. It was fun. It was fun, but it was a tough process.
Yeah, it was fun. We had various times where we hit impasses and took a break and then came back at it. And I remember one time we were kind of couldn't make progress, and I got on the plane and sat down in Thomas's office, and we looked at each other, and our problems disappeared in about 5 minutes. So I'm pretty convinced that Zoom is not the answer to all things. There's sitting down and working together is essential.
That's good to know.
If you do it in Sangalam, you're really lucky. So.
So tell us a little bit more about how the project developed from those initial conversations to the point where you had a manuscript to submit. What changed along the way? How did it develop?
I think out of our conversations, I drafted up something that was rough but exciting and building on property rights and some of the fancy arguments. And it was a struggle to get it done, but we were still excited about it. We got something we thought kind of worked, and walked it around a little bit. I think we went down to Bocconi and presented it to, I think Nikolai was there then and some of the other folks, and had great feedback. It was very nice. But I sort of reached an impasse on it. It was one of those places where my own thinking, it needed to be shook up, and we put it down for about 6 months. And I don't know what happened to Thomas, but Thomas got inspired. So you can tell that part. That's when we repackaged everything.
That was about it. I mean, there was this idea, about why do owner managed firms do not grow? Why they have issues to create value? And I found this to be a super intriguing question, and at the same time, very challenging to solve in this elegant way that we were looking for. And that led me then to kind of look for this kind of theoretical angle, and that led to property rights. And then I think I redrafted this first draft and then shipped it over to Bill and to see and find out what he was thinking. And we took it from there. And then it was back and forth for multiple months, I would say even more than a year. And we were really trying to hone and define and to get to this point of self-control and what you can do about it, and this dilemma of control. And I think that was it was constant back and forth and fine tuning and bringing to a level where we thought, okay, now we can show it to some potential experts and then collect some early feedback, and then finally to submit it to AMR.
Nice.
I mean, really, I think Thomas's genius was thinking that in linking the three dimensions of classic property rights, and then the control, the benefits and the liabilities, pretty much map to classic theory of the firm issues. Each a different one, whether there be whether moral hazards at play, whether there's holdup issues coming through in succession or in just changing your mind. And one thing I was going to say earlier is that one of the things that excited me about this is that it was about wealth creation. And one of the puzzles of wealth creation and why private firms is that, if you're going to go off on a flyer and try to implement some theory of value, it's awfully hard to do that with borrowed resources. It's really tough to do, place somebody else's money at risk to create something new.
Yeah.
And even in the venture world, the type of things that the VC funds fund, that's not really risky stuff. All that stuff is sufficiently well-defined that you can write up a business plan and send it out to a whole bunch of people and everybody recognize what that is. But the innovative stuff, the stuff that's really creative, that, leads to new markets and stuff, that's pretty crazy stuff. And to do that, you usually have to place your own resources at risk. And I think property rights and the private firm become really important issues.
Yeah, there's a difference between financing the execution of an idea and financing the exploration of ideas to find an idea, right? I think that's maybe what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the review process at AMR. How did the manuscript change through the review process?
This must be good. You start, please.
Well, the great thing about journals like AMR, top tier journals, is that you get really super people, super engaged. And if you write good stuff, promising stuff, they think really hard and they give you good feedback. And then you're challenged to reply. So in a lot of ways, we wrote something up and we didn't commit too many sins. So they gave us a shot to go back and try to fix things. But it was, how many rounds did we go? We went a couple anyway, maybe 3.
It was okay. I mean, I think people saw value in the novelty. I think to specifically focus on owner managed companies, that was a neat angle, combined with commitment problems. That was, I think, that attracted attention. But then obviously you run into people who are deeply versed in TCE writings and bring up, arguments that have been made early on in that theory that we were not aware of. So we really had to go back to Williamson and these original books and papers and to really go deep into these writings, and then kind of still show the novelty of what we were saying, and that goes definitely beyond what all these great theories have done before us.
What's the name? One of the reviewers referred us to what, a Hayek Society or something? What was the name of that?
It was a Mont Pelerin Society.
Oh, the Mont Pelerin Society. So here we get reference to something I didn't know anything about. So Thomas replies to it by going, next door and interviewing a member of it?
I mean, we by drawing from property right theory, and if you look at the origin of that theory, it goes back to the 60s, 50s, where people were concerned about the protection of property rights in the discussion about the rivaling economic systems.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, and during these times, there were also a large kind of very influential think tanks being put in place, like the Hayek Society, and one of those liberal think tanks was Mont Pelerin Society, which was luckily, placed and, or founded in Switzerland. And one of the reviewers was telling us, all these questions have been talked about in these meetings of the Mont Pelerin Society in 70s and 80s. And luckily, I know a few people who were members, that societies, and I could go there and interview them and say, you know, and kind of, that was a neat way to address some of the comments, but just also illustrates a bit the challenge and the justified comments we got during the process.
Yeah. And of course, we had a reviewer number 2.
There's always reviewer number 2. Yes.
There's always reviewer number 2, but reviewer number 2 in the end was quite generous, saying, well, you know, this is better than I thought. So it's okay, let's go.
Well, I'm glad you got the reviewers on board, because it is a fascinating paper. Now, what would you say were the biggest challenges that you faced on this project? Now, it could either be, you know, in the original development of the ideas, or in going through the review process and responding to reviewers, or maybe something else entirely that you haven't mentioned yet. What was the biggest challenge on this project?
Thomas, what do you think?
I think it was going beyond what we know about governance. For me personally, was kind of, you know, understanding what transaction costs really are, what commitment problems really are, and then to apply this to that specific context of owner-managed companies, and, you know, kind of to bridge these debates and very kind of, as I think, very distinct literature streams, different you know, vocabularies, languages, and methods that's been used in some of these literatures, to bring them together and kind of to create a consistent, simple story about something that in a way was out there, very obvious once you had written it, but to write that in consistent, simple language, that to me was the main challenge.
Mm-hmm. I think the main challenge was really kind of crafting a paper that treaded the line between these theories in a way that advocates for each were willing to sign on. You know, I'm out at University of Utah. There's a bunch of people here who are trained in transactions cost, as you well know. Yep. And for every theory, there's an advocate here and there. And as I said, I think one of the problems with the theory of the private firm is it's the arena in which all the theories of the firm collide. And none of them are alone sufficient to really explain the properties of what happens inside them. And you can even make that worse by saying that, you know, most of our economic theories are underspecified. They're kind of thin. You know, we've got agency theories that says incentives and contract are important. We got TCE that says contracts are important, yet you work within most firms and relatively few people, their monitoring is not obvious. Nobody reads a contract, and monitoring is like, what? So the way the firms actually operate is much more on a relational basis and interpersonally. And the private firm is the arena where all that stuff collides. So trying to put a paper out about the private firm that kind of treads the line where people will accept what you're saying about their particular theory and accept some of the tensions. It was tough, but we were lucky. I mean, we got to draw reviewers who are willing to say there's something here to think about.
Good. So you were able to convert the true believers of many churches to your views.
Maybe we just got a little bit of forbearance from them.
Okay. Well, that brings up the issue of, you know, the audience, right? Because different audiences will see different things in the paper. And I'm sure you experienced that in the review process based on what you're saying. So who is the target audience for this paper? Who should read it?
I'll speak to one group and you can speak to the other. One is, I think that people interested in the theory of the firm and entrepreneurs. The theory of the firm issue is that we really don't have a robust theory of the private firm. I've described it as a complex arena. We are offering something that I think could be an architecture for investigation, but it's complex. That's a hard place to go. So there's some theory of the firm folks that I think might be interested in it. The other is for the entrepreneur. And the entrepreneur, if you're trying to create value, you're putting together a team, you're trying to get people to commit their personal genius and energy to your particular theory of value. And the paper identifies a lot of the problems that you as the leader, as the founder may encounter. So I think it's useful to think about as an entrepreneur to describe the set of problems that arise with wealth creation, value creation. The other thing that it kind of does is there's a thread that's running through there that says, the private firm's really good for creating wealth. But that value creation process is probably delicate and in some ways probably self-destructive. So that in some ways you see the firms that create great value transition into something else. And you could also see private firms in which you've created initial value. You could probably mess that up. But as long as you're, are doing something that's relatively valuable, you got a nice niche in a small market or things, you can run that firm and continue to make money just fine, okay? You're earning economic returns. You're not really that much engaged in value creation per se. But the private firm is really good at that. So it's good at creating wealth. And once you got it, it's pretty good for perpetuating. But there's something unstable about it when it comes to value. And I don't understand that completely. Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with Bill here. I mean, it's truly theories of the firm people. I think there is a limited understanding that we currently have about the private firm. I think there's much to be done in this space. And secondly, indeed, entrepreneurs. And I think entrepreneurs, I think if you start talking to these people about self-control problems, about reliability issues, about succession hazards and control problems, I think they will, even in my experience, they immediately relate to this. I think also we do have substantial evidence for some of these problems. If you look at the Throne versus Kingdom paper by Noam Wasserman and some of this work, I think there's clearly evidence that these firms do have these issues. But I think we establish a broader understanding what the underlying problems are by talking about these stakeholder commitment issues. And I think we indeed, for practitioners, but also theory of the firm people, we provide a framework to structure that over discussion.
Thomas, why don't you talk a little bit about the family firm in this paper?
So, sorry, can I say that again?
About the family firm in this paper.
I mean, the other thing I think it allows us to do is to say, well, maybe within the field of private firms, there are different types of combinations here. If you think about the founder firm, there may be, that the advantages are absolutely key. And, at the beginning, maybe these issues, let's say succession issues, are not so prominent. But right. As firms start growing and want to scale, if you want to create something big, then, you start to think harder about how to enlist stakeholders, make credible commitments, and then reliability and control and over control becomes an issue. And if you then, move to the more established private firm like family firms, you could argue, well, maybe these firms are strong in terms of making credible commitments, at least to some extent, but at the same time, they run into succession issues. So different types of private firms may have different combinations of these issues. So there's also typology hidden behind these 6 elements that we described.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't know what those elements are yet. I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but sometimes you run into people that say family firms are distinctive and they need their own theory. And I think Thomas and I are of the view that if we have a robust theory of the private firm, we can think more elegantly about specific different types of firms, whether it be the partnership, whether it be the family firm, whether it be the founder firm, the gazelle, things like that. Mm-hmm. We can kind of think about what private ownership means in there and its benefits, its liabilities, and start to get some better understanding of the particular organizational solution each of those different types of firms has implemented.
Great. Well, just one last question for you, and that is about the impact that you hope this paper will have. And I guess I really mean this kind of in 4 arenas. What impact do you hope this paper will have in terms of its influence on future theory, in terms of its influence on future empirical research, in terms of its influence on future practice, and then perhaps even in terms of its influence on future policy.
Let me start with the back end. When it comes to policy, I wouldn't go as far as saying that we have, sorry about that background noise, my family is here. Policy-wise, I wouldn't say that there's immediate connects here with what we suggest, but I think for educators, for teachers, for people who provide executive education, not just for students, but also for more, let's say, established companies, to raise awareness about these strengths, the generic strength, the generic weaknesses these private firms have is of tremendous value. To have a discussion around that, but also have a discussion about these, the four governance mechanisms that Bill was describing in our second table, what the benefits and costs are of these mechanisms is a very useful exercise. So in that sense, for practice and policy, I would say that's what you're going to have from what you're going to take out from reading that paper.
Mm-hmm.
Then, empirically, just a few thoughts, we make pretty obvious propositions. We do not spell them out, but if you go into the second part of the paper, we make very explicit, about what we expect the functionality of, let's say, submission to social control, a management team, a board, what this will do to your company. And I think the great thing is, and the interesting thing is, it's double-edged sword. It comes with costs because it reduces the benefits of owner management, but also comes with benefits because it curbs these control hazards. And I think testing that empirically, also combination-wise and life cycle-wise, when different combinations of governance mechanisms help you to grow and create value, I think is a useful next step for people to work with this.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. How about you, Bill?
A couple of things. One is, in the world of theory, I think we've sketched an outline that others may engage with about how to flesh out a theory of the private firm. And at least we have something to work with now. And I hope other people engage with that. So I think that's one contribution. I think another is that, at least with respect to, I agree with Thomas. I think there's a lot of empirical issues that can be tested that fall out from the paper. And I look forward to seeing some of those things. But there is a policy issue, and that is, we've got, I think, a very important issue looming on our horizon. And that is, we really don't have a theory of the closely held firm. We understand public firms. We don't have a theory of the private firm. But if you don't have a theory of the private firm, trying to understand what the consequences of closely held ownership might be are difficult. And the problem we have there is that a significant portion of the world's wealth is concentrated now in closely held firms, whether it's right. Facebook, the Googles, the Teslas, or whatever. What we've got is a group of entrepreneurs that for some reason we have granted them extraordinary control over an extraordinary portion of the world's wealth. We know that they're going to face succession issues. We know that family issues will arise. We know that there's a bunch of things that are going to happen down the road that have important policy implications for investors, shareholders, for family. And we just really don't have a good theory about what's next. We know that shareholders have said, okay, this founder is so brilliant, we're willing to give them control to run the firm for a while longer and make us more money. But what are the long-term consequences of that? Most of these great entrepreneurs are young, but we know that the great entrepreneurs of the past got old. Henry Ford turned into a tyrant. Rockefeller did this, did that. There's a whole bunch of issues that are going to come down the line. And we just don't have any theoretical frame or tools to really talk about that at length.
Neat. Good. Well, I'm out of questions. So you've answered all my questions. So thank you, gentlemen, both for participating in the interview. I look forward to seeing this paper in print in the journal itself. I believe it's already available on the website of the journal. And thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
us.
Rich. This has been
Thanks,
great.
Rich.